Mark is the director of the Center of Latin American Studies and professor of the practice of conflict resolution and human rights in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He also serves as program director in Georgetown and in the Andes conflict resolution and human rights with the University of the Andes in Bogota, Colombia. Before joining the faculty of Georgetown in 1996, he served as the director of Latin American Studies program and as an associate professor of political science at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Previously, he was also deputy director at the Institute of Latin American and Iberian Studies at the University of Columbia. Good morning to everyone. As I just said, my name is Mark Chernik. Yes, I have a lot of experience as a teacher. I've also been in the country for more than 36 years, following these peace processes. I arrived in 1980 at a time when the M19 took the residence of the American Embassy, and from this time I have started a series of peace processes, as you know, that are ending today in Havana. I say all this because what is happening in Havana is very impressive. It is historic. The negotiations are going very well, and we are confident that some agreements will be reached. But there is a gap between the success of what is happening in Havana and what is happening in this country. The country as a whole does not recognize the historical facts to find a political solution to the armed conflict. And yet, and this is the purpose of this panel, which will leave Havana, is a general framework. But peace will not be built at the national level, but at the level of regions. And it is very important to have a focus on the regions, which means peace. And we must understand that is fine. It is to transform an armed conflict to a political and social non-violent competition. And it's not to end conflicts, but to handle the conflicts without violence through political and social processes. And if it is not understood in this way, if a person goes to the regions and sees that the diversity of the actors in Havana, there are two players, the FARC and the government. You can go to any region and there are different actors. One goes to Cauca and sees the Indians, the landowners, the farmers, the people of African descent who are not at the table in Havana. Their interests are not at the table. And what you have to do there, or in the middle Magdalena, with government interests, mining, oil, these things are not on the table and they will not leave in the peace deal. But what would but in these regions we have to open the discussion to these actors. Now, if you open the conversation or dialogue to the actors in the region, and we, Georgetown University, with other governmental organizations, non-governmental organizations here at the CNIT, the church regional dialogues, There is great skepticism. You all know that. Many people in the regions do not look favorably upon what is happening. The Indians believe that what will come out of the land agreements will be a threat to their indigenous territories. And that many believe that national interests or local interests will not be taken into account. There's then the important thing, which is to open this discussion. But at the table in Havana, we have the FARC, the government. If you reach an agreement with the FARC, and if the FARC are able to withdraw, leaving the armed struggle and becoming a political party in social movement, the question is, what will happen with the other armed actors? A peace with the FARC, who meet the other armed actors in the region, or the tolerance that various social and state actors have for them will not bring peace. There will not be a regional dialogue where you can convert that. So it is extremely important that when we talk about territorial peace, there is a framework of changes and the possibility of transforming an armed conflict, that the state, the government, that they all make a great policy to dismantle everything in the literature of the sabotagers, the paramilitaries, the state, and the social sectors to support it. This will all be key. But with just this, there will not be peace. This is the vision of territorial peace. Let's talk a little about land and land restitution. When President Santos, on the day of his first inauguration announcement that he held, he said that he held the key to peace in his pocket, that he had ideas and began to open the ground for a peace process. One of the most interesting things he did with Congress was that he passed the law that victims and land restitution, which was very important and significant. Many analysts, many activists, many non-governmental organizations, many international organizations have long been the engine of the main conflict, or one of the engines of the conflict is a matter of land. He didn't do this at the political level. When Santos said what we were going to have, which was a policy of land restitution and to recognize the victims, which are both very important, it was to put the issue of land at the front. How does one understand this analysis of the great engine of the conflict that has been a matter of land? I would say, more or less in general terms, there are two arguments. One is the process has we have already seen nearly 200 years of colonization. what has happened, and especially in the last 60 or 70 years, is a process of agricultural colonizing, external and internal borders between the ridges, and this process has been a process that has encouraged more and more violence. And how is this process? The process is in farming communities that have been displaced from their communities, which migrate to new territories, which come down the mountain, establish new communities, and behind them are commercial interests of lieutenants, the lieutenants' land, and in the last few decades of the paramilitaries, and the reconcentration of land, exploitation of the farmers again, and the new immigration and colonization. This has been a seamless process, and the settlement areas, the process of migrating to establish communities being displaced, has been a major component of the war. An agrarian law of 1994, Law 160, attempted to deal with this process, and this law created a figure called the Farmers Reserve Zone. The idea of the figure of the Farmers Reserve Zone was to break this process of colonization, for the establishment of rural communities, the reconcentration of land, and the expulsion of the farmers. The figure of the reserve area of the farmers was to prohibit the concentration of land to create, and the law was also focused on the areas of colonization, to give some guarantees and protections of to a farming economy and farming communities, to give stability and break these trends of expulsion of farmers and inciting conflict. Well, this time it was difficult to establish these farming areas. I was part of a project where we created a pilot project in El Pato, in San Jose. It was difficult, but curiously the figure has returned in the agreements of Havana, and they are trying to create in the zones of farming reserve to give a kind stability to the farming economy. And this is something important because it's a great step in it's establishing the field. And now if they manage to create zones for farming reserves, from at least from my reading, there are some contradictions which are not resolved within what is coming out of Havana. There is a farming vision. There are also visions of agro-industrial zones. They are not resolved. In the law 160, the zones for farming reserves were only in the zones of colonization. We're going to see how how they're going to establish this. Another thing I would say is the vision that we know, the progressive vision. It's interesting that it comes out of Havana. It's a vision which is eh, very inclined towards the farmers. There still isn't a great vision of the territories of African descent, the indigenous territories, which are a part of the question to stabilize the territories in the coming days. I think they're going in Havana. I think it's going to happen in these days for the first time. Afro-descending representatives and African indigenous are going to Havana. I think the truth is, I think they have been asking for 3 years for for this appointment, but it's coming. And there are many exceptions within the first item on the agenda. So you can do that. It must incorporate a vision of indigenous farming and African territory that has been heading contractions in parts of the country, that will have an economy of agriculture and others where there we have a protected farming economy. Understanding that the land problem, the chances of the field that we have in the field, we've had the name of this conference is land restitution, and I made reference to the law, to the victims and the land restitution. What happened there was the creation of a land restitution policy, the creation of a unit to restore land, but it was so far, it has been so far a single policy. It is very difficult to implement a policy of land return in the midst of conflict. Very difficult to go or return unresolved issues, or without resolving the issues of backroom, of security, and for that reason, until now, the success has been very limited. But if there's going to be a policy of of land return in the midst of conflict, it is very difficult. But there would have to be an integral participation from everyone, from all points and themes that are coming out of the peace process. I mean, the land that has to be the talking point, or the land must be within the issue of agrarian reform. It must be within the issue of participation, and it has to be within the issue of the substitution of illicit crops. It must be within disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. I don't think an isolated policy will work. But restoring land is possible within a large framework of comprehensive peace. We know uh, we know that it will end up here, more or less. We know from the experience of recent years here in Colombia, we know from international experience, from the vast majority of the displaced people who will not return to their lands, uh, that's not going to happen. And there are many areas where it is almost impossible for that to be done. We have worked in areas of the Middle Magdalena where there has been a high concentration of land, which is also seen today in Urabá, in the south of Bolivar. It is all, everyone there is is African Colombian, strewn with extensions of kilometers after kilometers of African palm, and it is not the farmers that are in the urban areas, but the production of African palm, which was delayed for 8 years to make it profitable. This cannot be returned. You can give some thought to cooperatives. We're doing that, but it's not so easy to return the land. Then you have to think and return to where we were. Who are left with the region? What are their needs? What kind of economy? If you have rural economies, will there be agro-industrial economies? Where will the Afro descendants and the indigenous territories fit in? What rights will there be? What happens in this transition period with the ceasefire, with the FARC, and with the establishment of zones of concentration? If the FARC are going to leave these areas, everything that you have to think about, and within that, you can think about who will benefit from these restitution policies. And finally, the post-conflict political process and peace building can be made by laws, by framework, and above all by the state. From the law, or they may be processes that come from the bottom up. There have been experiences in the country, many experiences in Middle Magdalena, with the development of programs and peace, and in other parts of the country there have been experiences from the bottom up. I think these decisions about how they will organize the post-conflict, organize the dialogue, they must come from below and not from above. But it will not be possible if the war is not over. And it is this to conclude the peace process and to put an end to the sabotagers that are there and that are a threat to all that is coming. Thank you very much.